In ancient Egypt, the dead were not simply buried. They were transformed, and the architect of that transformation, the god who stood over every corpse, every ritual chamber, every wrapped and anointed body, was Anubis, the jackal god. For over 3,000 years, no Egyptian could enter the underworld without facing him first. Anubis is among the oldest gods in human history. The pyramid texts, inscribed on the stone walls of tombs around 2400 BCE, name him as Lord of the Dead long before any other deity claimed that throne. He is older than Osiris, older than the Nile itself, in the minds of Egyptians. His worship stretched back into prehistory, into an age when the boundary between animal and divine was not yet clearly drawn. His origins lie in a simple, dark observation. Jackals haunted the cemeteries of the Nile Valley. They clawed at the sand above the dead, drawn by the scent of decay. The Egyptians could have seen them as desecrators, as demons. Instead, they saw something far stranger. They saw guardians. Jackals became sacred because they seemed to understand the boundary between life and death in ways humans could not. The earliest evidence places Anubis worship in the first dynasty, around 3100 BCE. But some Egyptologists argue the veneration goes back even further, into the pre-dynastic period, when nomadic peoples first settled the Nile and began burying their dead with ritual intention. The question becomes, when did Anubis first appear in human consciousness? The pyramid texts describe Anubis with a specific title, he of the jackal, or the black one. This black color was deliberate. Ancient Egyptians associated black not with evil, but with the fertile black soil of the Nile, the source of all life. Yet Anubis was black in death. And in the tomb inscriptions, he appears alone, always watching. The pyramid texts contain a spell, a ritual incantation, meant to protect the deceased from Anubis himself. But why would they need protection from their own god of resurrection? The answer lies in a terrifying concept that haunted Egyptian belief, the second death. A pharaoh could be mummified, their body preserved, their tomb sealed with riches. But if Anubis deemed them unworthy, if they had lived without Ma'at, without cosmic balance, they would not be allowed to pass into the afterlife. They would be annihilated, erased, forgotten. Anubis had the power not just to welcome the dead, but to condemn them to oblivion. And there is more. Anubis was not merely a guardian of tombs. He was the god of embalming itself. Every priest who mummified a body had to invoke Anubis's name, had to perform the ritual in his honor, had to effectively become Anubis themselves. During the mummification process, the high priest wore a jackal mask, a direct transformation into the god. And when that mask was placed upon a living human face, something was believed to change. The boundary between priest and deity blurred. What ceremonies took place in those sealed embalming chambers? But here is the revelation that shifts everything. Anubis was not always the supreme lord of the dead. By the Middle Kingdom, roughly 2000 BCE, his power was usurped. Osiris, the god of resurrection and rebirth, rose in prominence. Anubis was demoted. He became the guardian of the tomb, the steward of the dead, a subordinate. Yet something about this demotion suggests a darker truth. Perhaps Anubis was too powerful, too terrible. Perhaps the Egyptians needed a more merciful god. Perhaps they were afraid. The name Anubis is itself a translation. The Egyptians called him Inpu, or Anpu, a word possibly derived from the root meaning to decay or to putrefy. But Inpu also carried another meaning, the royal child, suggesting he was born of divine necessity. Some scholars argue Anubis originated as a local jackal deity in the necropolis of Abydos, then was incorporated into the larger Osirid mythology. But the archaeological evidence suggests the opposite. That Anubis was so fundamental, so ancient, that all other death gods were built around him. The temple of Abydos, built by Seti I around 1290 BCE, contains the most elaborate Anubis iconography ever discovered. The walls depict not just his form, but his functions, his aspects, his interactions with pharaohs and the dead. Inscriptions describe him as Lord of the necropolis, he who is upon his mountain, and opener of the ways. This last title is crucial. Anubis literally opened the path for souls to journey into the afterlife. He was the gatekeeper to the underworld. Without his blessing, the journey was impossible. Across all of Egypt, variations of Anubis worship emerged. In Upper Egypt, he was depicted as purely black, the color of the Nile's fertile mud, but also of putrefaction. In Lower Egypt, some versions showed him with reddish coloring. Some texts describe him as Anubis of the West, a clear reference to the location of the dead, where the sun sets. Regional temples developed local interpretations. Anubis the fierce, Anubis the merciful, Anubis the consumer of the unworthy. But all shared one essential truth: he was inevitable. Death would come, and Anubis would be waiting. No god of death in any other ancient culture held such practical, ritualistic power. The Sumerian Nergal was fearsome but distant. The Greek Hades was circumscribed by law. But Anubis was present. Present in the mummification wrappings. Present in the embalming spices. Present in the very acts the living performed to honor the dead. To worship Anubis was to participate in death rituals constantly. To live in ancient Egypt was to live in the shadow of Anubis's dominion. The most extreme account of Anubis's power comes from the Coffin Texts, a collection of spells and instructions for the afterlife, written on the coffins and tomb walls of the Middle Kingdom. One spell describes Anubis as a shapeshifter, capable of appearing in any form, moving invisible through the tombs, inspecting the dead. Another spell warns of the hour when Anubis walks, a specific time in the night when his presence was strongest, when the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead became dangerously thin. Egyptians believed certain hours were marked by his activity. Archaeologists discovered something unsettling in the necropolis at Saqqara. Beneath the mastaba tomb of a high official named Tahotep, they found a hidden chamber. On the walls were not the usual funeral prayers or records of the deceased's virtues. Instead, there were only repeated images of Anubis, hundreds of them, smaller and smaller, spiraling toward a central point. And at the center, nothing. An empty space. As if Anubis had been summoned there, repeatedly, intensely, for a purpose no tomb inscription ever revealed. The Egyptians performed a ritual called the opening of the mouth, a ceremony meant to restore the ability of the deceased to eat, drink, and breathe in the afterlife. The ceremony required the priest, wearing the Anubis mask, to use a sacred adze, a ritual tool to touch the mouth of the mummified body. This was the most intimate moment in Egyptian funerary practice. The priest, transformed into Anubis, literally opened the mouth of the dead. They were not two separate beings. The boundary had dissolved. What transformed the priest in those moments? What did he experience while masked as the Jackal god, standing alone in the tomb with the wrapped corpse of the deceased? There is a papyrus, preserved in the British Museum, document known as the Papyrus of Ani, that contains a spell meant to prevent Anubis from seizing the deceased. The language is extraordinary. It describes Anubis as having claws that can grasp, teeth that can bite, a hunger that must be satisfied. The spell is not a prayer. It is a negotiation, a binding contract. "I know your name," the deceased declares, speaking directly to Anubis. "I know the names of the 42 demons that follow you. I speak and you must listen." The implication is clear. Knowing Anubis's true name gave one power over him. And if his name could be forgotten, his grip on the dead could be broken. The true nature of Anubis emerges in a moment of complete clarity from the pyramid texts. He is not a god of death. He is a god of transformation, of the corpse becoming something else, of the boundary itself, not the land of the living, not the land of the dead, but the threshold between them. He stands eternally at that boundary, enforcing the crossing. Anubis does not kill. He collects what death has already taken, and he decides what happens next. The most powerful encounter with Anubis appears in the funerary text of Kymwesit, a prince of the 19th dynasty. The text describes his moment of death not as a peaceful transition, but as a meeting. As Kymwesit's consciousness left his body, he encountered a figure, black, jackal-headed, holding scales. Anubis did not speak. He simply weighed the prince's heart against the feather of Maat. And in that silence, Kymwesit knew everything that had ever mattered about his existence would be judged in an instant. He knew that Anubis already knew the truth. The god could not be deceived. The dead cannot lie before Anubis. And here we return to the beginning. The hook. We opened with the statement, the dead were not simply buried. They were transformed, and Anubis was the architect of that transformation. That transformation was not metaphorical. It was absolute. The mummified body, the wrapped corpse, the preserved remains, these were not the dead. They were the transitional form. Anubis received them in that state, half preserved, half decayed, and guided them into whatever came next. To fear Anubis was to fear the most inevitable truth, that all of us will one day stand where he stands, at the threshold, awaiting his judgment. The worship of Anubis did not fade when later dynasties elevated Osiris. Instead, it evolved. In the Greco-Roman period, Anubis was syncretized with Greek deities like Hermes, another god of transitions and boundaries. The Romans encountered the Anubis cult in Egypt and were profoundly moved by it. Mysteries cults dedicated to Anubis sprang up across the Mediterranean. His power transcended Egyptian borders. Any culture that built tombs, that practiced careful burial, that believed the dead required protection and guidance, they recognized themselves in Anubis. In modern Egyptology, the study of Anubis reveals something crucial about ancient Egyptian culture itself. They did not deny death. They did not flee from it. Instead, they created an entire theological system to master it, to systematize it, to make it predictable and navigable. Anubis became the tool of that mastery. He made death rational. He made the boundary knowable. And in doing so, the Egyptians achieved something no other ancient civilization quite managed. They transformed death from something to be feared into something to be prepared for, ritualized, controlled. Anubis still appears in modern culture, in films, literature, museums, and the popular imagination. But his power in those representations is a shadow of his original significance. In ancient Egypt, Anubis was not a metaphor. He was a presence, a force, an inevitable encounter that shaped every moment of Egyptian life. He was the god who turned the dead into beings capable of eternal existence. He was the reason a pharaoh could commission a tomb and believe, truly believe, that it would protect them forever. Anubis remains perhaps the most consequential god in human history, not because he created anything, but because he managed the boundary between creation and dissolution. He made death comprehensible, and in doing so, he changed the course of civilization. If you found this exploration of Egypt's god of death and resurrection haunting, like this video, subscribe for more dark history and mythology. We release new documentaries every week.